The village of Veles rested like a sleeping otter on the crescent of its bay, huddled against granite cliffs and the rustle of windswept grass. At dawn, the shore awoke to gulls yelping and the glassy hush of tide. Reel nets hissed through the morning air, slapping water in arching silvers. Yet the first figure most people noticed was the thin, scar-haired man who never stepped into a boat. He carried no tackle, no bait box, only a crooked staff of driftwood and a leather satchel filled with loose pages. To newcomers, it seemed ridiculous, almost vaudevillian. Why would a man sit beside fishermen while holding nothing but paper? But the villagers greeted him with nods as indispensable as sunrise. They called him Timon the Shorecaster, Veles' strangest, kindest fisherman. When Timon arrived each morning, he would press the end of his staff into damp sand as though setting a slender mast. He let the sea soak his boots so they darkened like kelp. Then he pulled a sheet from his satchel, rolled it into a cylinder, and raised it above his shoulder the way other men hefted their nets. With a slow, deliberate flick of his wrist, he cast the scroll toward the horizon. The paper unfurled, but instead of flying away, it vanished, as if drawn between two unseen fingers of air. Bystanders swore they heard a faint splash beyond the breakers, though no object pierced the surface. A moment of breathless waiting followed. Then Timon would reel nothing tangible in, just close his hand around invisible thread until the curl of parchment reappeared, blank no longer. Black lines and images glittered across it, drying like ink caught in sunlight. He never read his sketch aloud immediately. First, he studied it, nodding or frowning, deciding whom the story belonged to. After the boats returned near noon, the quay became an informal amphitheater. Nets groaned with cod and mackerel, but the villagers gathered around Timon's overturned crate as faithfully as they weighed their harvest. With a throat clearing that sounded like the scrape of oars, he began to speak. Whatever words spilled from him were the words newly netted from the sea's shimmering hush. Listeners felt them not only through their ears, but in marrow, as if Timon opened a window far behind the mind. Some wept, some laughed so hard their shoulders shook, all left feeling full, though they'd eaten nothing. His stories make the soul chew, old Baker Rada liked to say, wiping flour from her cheeks. Timon's gift, people believed, had sprouted from sorrow. He had once been a fleet fisher himself, strong enough to hoist lobster pots 2 at a time. One winter, a storm came early, shredding 3 boats and the men aboard. Timon alone survived, lashed unconscious to planks washed onto the tide. When he staggered home, he swore never to enter a vessel again. Instead, he began roaming the shoreline at twilight, scribbling fragments about sea glass or gull claws or the taste of grief. No one knew the moment those fragments began returning to him as complete tales. But gradually, villagers realized their own memories, some nearly forgotten, surfaced during his recitations. There was the night market that ceased 15 years earlier, the smell of juniper fire at a grandmother's wake, the whistle of a brother lost to war. Timon told them in voices so intimate, people assumed he'd spied through keyholes of time. He insisted he merely caught what drifted. One blustery October, Veles faced a different peril. A corporation from the city arrived with charts and signatures, intent on building a cannery by the bay's mouth. It promised steady wages, but required dredging the fertile shallows and installing turbines that would churn sediment into a sterile fog. The offer divided the village like a rip current. Families with debts eyed the cannery as rescue. Others feared losing the water's clarity that cradled their fathers' and mothers' nets. The mayor planned a referendum, yet anxiety gnawed. If tensions boiled, neighbors might turn strangers overnight. On the eve before voting, Timon climbed the western bluff, staff tapping shale. The wind battered him, but he stood like a thin mast again, parchment in hand. He cast once, twice, thrice, until the moonless dark swallowed everything. At dawn, he returned with several rolled pages bound by twine. Rumor spread that he'd prepared a special telling. The hall filled beyond capacity. Even those who dismissed him as superstition came, seeking distraction from conflict. Timon did not seat himself upon the crate, but remained standing. His eyes looked bruised with exhaustion, yet a mild fire burned behind them. He unrolled the first page. A memory of water, he announced. Silence clamped the room. He spoke of a time centuries past when the bay was not a bay but a forest. Rain pooled among cedars, coaxing frogs to chorus. Then an earthquake cracked roots, and seawater flooded through. Creatures of brine met creatures of bark, and instead of annihilation, they exchanged gifts. The octopus learned how to hide like a woodpecker behind hollow trunks. The deer learned the curve of tides written into sand. Timon's voice color shifted, echoing both surf and leaf wind. Villagers felt their skin ripple with phantom gills. They tasted resin and salt on the same breath. Remember, he concluded, our home was born of merging, not conquering. He did not wait for applause. The second tale unwound, the net of names. He described an early fisherwoman, Neaja, who wrote a name on every fish she caught before releasing it at season's end. Years later, descendants still found haddock etched with the faint silvering of letters. The practice taught them that taking must be answered with giving, a name for a life, reverence for sustenance. Again, villagers listened, imagining their own names glimmering beneath scales, sliding through cold green corridors. 3 more stories followed. Each seemed to vibrate with the present debate, though set in distant myth. A dawn when stars were stones thrown back into sky after villagers forgot to look up. An evening when a blind boy mapped tides by touching hearts, proving that the shape of the sea is held inside people before outside boats. A storm where a single bead of kindness hardened into an anchor that saved a drifting fleet. None mentioned canneries, progress, or economics, yet every listener felt a dread. When Timon finished, he bowed so low his forehead grazed the rolled crate. Minutes passed before anyone breathed full. Then something stranger occurred. The fishermen, fishwives, the schoolmaster, even the tavern rivals stepped outside without speaking and walked to the shoreline. No one commanded them. They lined up barefoot where wave tongues licked toes. One by one, they wrote their names with finger ruts into wet sand, watched the water erase them, and smiled, not with defeat, but with recognition. What they wished to build, buy, or resist, they now weighed against the hush that swallowed those names and returned only foam. By nightfall, the majority voted down the cannery. The corporation sailed away like a tarnished gull. For months afterward, peace lingered fragrant as smoked eel. Timon grew gaunt. Casting stories drained him more quickly, as though bigger, older memories tugged harder on his invisible line. Some mornings he could not lift the staff. The village doctor offered tonic. Timon refused. I am not sick, he said. I am full. He looked indeed swollen, as if stuffed with impossible light. Spring arrived with crocus spears. Children noticed Timon had stopped catching new pages. Instead, he reread old tales beside the breakwater, voice faint but steady, like a lighthouse whose bulb had dimmed, though its rotation never faltered. The community worried. What if the shorecaster himself disappeared? Who would feed the soul then? They decided to act not with medicine, but mirroring. On the first Sunday of May, before Timon reached the beach, he discovered every adult and child waiting. Each held a scrap of paper, newsprint, recipe cards, ledger sheets. The mayor stepped forward and presented Timon his own staff, polished and engraved with tiny waves. Then each villager in turn flicked their sheet toward the horizon, mimicking Timon's casting motion. Papers fluttered onto breeze, settled on water, or simply dropped. They laughed at the clumsiness, but the gesture blossomed with earnestness. Timon's lips twitched upward, eyes shining wet. You learned the language, he whispered. The crowd urged him to sit while they told stories for him to hear. Some offered clumsy anecdotes about first kisses by lantern boats or the day ice cracked under sled runners but spared a brother's ankle. Others recounted nightmares that had stalked them until Timon's tales gave spine to their courage. Even the stern harbor master admitted he'd reconciled with his estranged daughter after a story about moon-tethered birds. Timon listened, hands folded, face tilted, absorbing every syllable like rain on cracked earth. That night, a thunderstorm bullied the coastline. Forked lightning bared skeletons of cliff trees, and wind hammered shutters. Villagers lay awake, counting seconds between flash and rumble. When dawn hesitated in gray drizzle, they found the beach changed. In place of Timon's usual crate stood his staff planted deep, wrapped in twine threaded through hundreds of pages, his entire archive flapping like prayer flags. Timon himself was gone. Search parties combed coves and cottages. His bed remained undisturbed, boots by the door. Some feared he'd drowned, finally seduced back to sea. but nets dragged across the bay pulled only kelp and driftwood. There was no corpse, no trace, besides those fluttering tails. Grief thickened. Children lingered under the paper banners, reading aloud, unwilling to let stories fade under rain. Adults brought tar to waterproof the sheets. Someone suggested the pages be bound and stored. Others argued they belonged where Timon left them, free to tatter into ghoul bedding. The debate echoed the old cannery quarrel: preserve or let be. Before frustration blew open, a 9-year-old girl named Elena climbed the staff base and tugged one page free, and she folded it into a boat and set it afloat. The paper ship bobbed, unraveled, and sank, yet as it vanished, several villagers swore they heard Timon's voice, faint, amused, telling a brand new story about a fisherman who taught a storm to dance. Word spread. Curiosity displaced sorrow. People removed pages and folded them into boats, planes, kites, hats. Each object carried a fragment of story, some previously heard, some entirely unfamiliar. Whenever a form dissolved in water or wind, words transformed into memories inside whoever watched. Carving knives recalled grandfathers, honeysuckle vines recalled first lullabies. The village streets bloomed with recollection. Timon's absence became presence, distributed among them. Years flowed. Children who once sat cross-legged before Timon grew into sailors, bakers, weavers, even scholars who journeyed inland. Wherever they settled, they taught others to cast paper toward horizon lines, rivers, deserts, skyscrapers, skylines. They said the practice cleaned rust from remembrance, that sharing memory nourished hungers nothing else could fill. Some skeptics indulged to humor friends, yet emerged bewildered by sudden sense of childhood moss. Libraries began hosting shore-casting evenings, and old age homes observed improved spirit. Back in Veles, the staff still stood like a sundial. Pages dwindled to threads until only one remained, sun-bleached, near invisibility. No one dared move it. An unspoken pact formed that the last page would stay as guardian. On midsummer nights, children gathered to hear whomever felt brave enough to improvise a tale between the staff's shadow and the foam edge. They discovered a strange thing. If a teller paused, hesitant, a word not their own occasionally tumbled out, crisp and salty. Timon, it seemed, lent phrases from the Gulf, where he now wandered. Decades later, a historian arrived, driven by rumors of memory fishermen. She interviewed elders who described Timon until their voices frayed like hemp. The historian hoped for photograph or census record. None existed. Frustrated, she visited the beach. Seeing the lone page, she feared wind might claim it before her research concluded. She reached up, fingers trembling, and felt a spark, like mild static but deeper, a pulse of living water. She withdrew hand, overcome by sudden recollection of her grandmother singing a lullaby never sung since the woman's funeral. Tears blurred shoreline. That night, she wrote her essay differently, not as documentation, but as story. She published it anonymously. Readers across continents felt stirred, though they couldn't explain why. One winter, ice sealed the bay such that even tide grunts fell silent. On solstice morning, villagers found the staff toppled. The last page had flown. Children tracked tiny holes where it once fluttered, marveling at gusts that carried no paper scrap. Rather than mourn, they built a small cairn of sea-rounded stones over the staff's base and etched onto the highest pebble a simple phrase: cast what feeds. There was no ceremony, yet the act felt final and beginning at once. In the decades that followed, Veles changed in ways Timon's early listeners would scarcely recognize. Solar lamps along alleys, drones delivering medicine during storms, a marine research lab studying plankton fluorescence. But one thing never altered. At dawn, before engines thrummed, villagers, scientists, artists, janitors alike approached shoreline. Some brought notebooks, some nothing. They closed eyes and cast arms wide, releasing invisible parchments toward a horizon always a fingertip farther. They waited, and in the hush between gull calls, they heard stories returning, sometimes clear, sometimes fractured like mirrored shells. They carried them into the day the way earlier generations carried cod and mackerel, nourishment vital as bread. One Miss Bew morning, a young sailor named Kaya, who had practiced shore casting since childhood, stood alone upon the wet sand. A distant tanker horn sounded, yet beach felt secluded, cupped by gray. Kaya had been wrestling with fear of leaving Veles for the deep-sea expedition that the research lab planned. She felt tugged between loyalty to home and the lure of places storms might paint new colors. She pulled a blank page from coat pocket, though no one used paper anymore. She kept some for tradition. With a flick reminiscent of Timon's, she cast it. The sheet did not fly far. Wind slapped it onto water where it floated like a white gull. She waited. Moments stretched. Suddenly the page folded itself along invisible creases once, twice, thrice, until it became a tiny boat, upright among ripples. It spun, prow pointing seaward, as if inviting her. Kaija laughed aloud, nerves dissolving like sugar. She read the handwriting now, traced along the origami hull. Go. I am already everywhere. The signature was a swirl resembling a fishhook, forming a letter T. Kaija placed palms to heart, inhaled brine thick with dawn. She turned, sure-footed, toward the docks where her vessel lay moored. Behind her, the paper boat drifted outward until a wave lifted it into sky like a fin. At that instant, though nobody witnessed, a voice traveled through salt air subtle as mist, wrapping shore and horizon in the same syllable, home. Thus, the fishermen who never left shore traveled farther than any hull, writing each story into whomever listened, netting memories that multiplied rather than emptied. And Valles, nourished by such invisible harvests, thrive proof that some hungers are met not by filling stomachs, but by opening them to the vast, shimmering broth of being alive, where every remembered moment swims, waiting to be cast, caught, and shared again.